Welcome to PPL Expert. My name is Tom and I'll be presenting this presentation on diversions. The presentation is designed to give pilots of all experience either an initial understanding or a refresher on diversions, the procedures and also calculating it in flight. Feel free to pause the video at any point to write down any notes or write down any questions that you may have. So what are we going to cover? We're going to cover what a diversion is, reasons to divert, so what reasons may cause us to change our original plan, how to plan a diversion in flight. Then we're going to look at methods of regaining our planned diverted track. So once we're on a diversion, if we see that we're off what we've planned, how we can regain the planned diversion. And then we're going to be looking at tricks for being less prepared. So in practice, when you have to divert, you may not have suitable equipment with you. So what other things we can use in the aircraft, which is going to help us plan a diversion and be as safe as possible. So what is a diversion? A diversion is a deviation from our original plan or our planned destination. So it's a change in what we were originally going to do. And the diversion itself is an unplanned leg from A to B, so from a current position or a position in the future to a different position than was originally planned, using what we've got available in the air. Okay, so it's not generally planned on the ground. There may be an instance where you do plan a diversion on the ground, but we'll look at that slightly later on. Okay, and there's lots of different reasons why an aircraft may divert, and we'll look at a couple of reasons here, but there's many more than just this. So firstly, low fuel. So maybe we've miscalculated the fuel. We've been flying a long time, the headwind's been stronger than expected, causing our fuel burn to be higher. So maybe we're getting low and we don't think we can reach our destination. That could be one reason. Possibly bad weather, so maybe the weather wasn't quite what we expected, so that we want to divert. Fatigue or illness, so maybe the pilot or even the passengers become unwell, so it's better to land as soon as possible rather than pressing on. Or maybe there's an aircraft or system malfunction, so maybe a system on the plane's not working or something like that. So trying to be as safe as possible, and depending on the kind of reason we have to divert will depict the severity of or how quickly we actually need to divert. But we'll look at that slightly later on. So why is it important that we study diversions? Well, for the student pilot, it's going to comprise as part of the skills test. So it's going to be a major element of the PPL skills test or LAPL, or any, possibly even a commercial pilot's license as well will be doing diversions. And it's also important to learn and improve airmanship. So learning what you might have to do in the real life once you have got your license and you go and flying by yourself. And that's where, for license holders and experienced pilots, it becomes more applicable. Okay, so for checkouts or tests, so there might be a scenario, even after you've got your license, you might have to do a checkout, and the examiner may ask you to do a diversion just to see you're still current and able to do so. To avoid complacency-based threats, so possibly if you're going flying and the weather's marginal, an experienced pilot might think it's okay, but then maybe once getting up in the air, they think, oh, it's not so great. So planning a diversion in this sense might be practical. And then also any last minute changes in flight. So again, lots of different reasons why a diversion could happen, but we're looking today about how we could plan that in the safest way. So when considering a diversion, the type of scenario that we're faced with, or the reason that we've got to divert, will stipulate how quickly and the urgency of the diversion. Obviously, if there's a major system malfunction in the aircraft, then the urgency is going to be increased. If the maybe a passenger is not feeling too well, then suddenly that urgency is decreased because it's not life or death. Effectively. Okay, so there is a gauge of how quickly we need to decide on our diversion, but what's always prudent and what most pilots should do is always have a planned diversion before taking off. Okay, this means that in the unlikely case that you do need to divert, we've already got one planned, and that's going to save this planning in the air. Okay, so maybe it'll be near an aerodrome that we're flying to. So if the aerodrome closes, we can go here, or maybe it's one en route that we're familiar with. Again, it's going to reduce the workload in the aircraft should we need to land somewhere else from our destination or from where we've taken off from. And as I said before, emergency may stipulate this planning in the air. So if it's a really urgent scenario, then we're going to have to plan to land as soon as possible. Okay, now where we land is completely up to us. There may have to be a scenario where we might not even make it to a runway. That would be a forced landing. But today we're going to look at a diversion to another airfield. And there's a lot of different things that we need to consider. So the runway there, so the condition of the runway, whether it's tarmac or grass, the length of it, so the aircraft we're flying, can we land on that runway? Possible facilities at the aerodrome, so crew, maintenance. So if we've got a maintenance issue, maybe one airfield might be better than the other to fix that issue. Possibly facilities for the crews, so a restaurant or somewhere to stay. If we're flying IFR, maybe what approaches are available, and then also familiarity. So are we familiar with the aerodrome, or is it completely new to us? And that's obviously going to change the effectively, can we go there or not, or the safety margin in going to a particular airfield. So for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to be looking at the VFR diversion procedure. So when we're flying VFR, which is aimed at the LAPL and the PPL licenses. If you were flying IFR, then the diversion procedure is a little bit different. By and large the same, but there's obviously some other considerations that you need to take into account. Okay, so we're going to look at the VFR procedure today. So before we go any further, we're just going to have a bit of a recap on dead reckoning, okay, which is the principle of navigation for the LAPL and the PPL, most navigation in fact for VFR aircraft, and by doing this it's going to enable us to talk through the diversion procedure with more understanding. But effectively what dead reckoning is using the principle of speed, distance and time. So if we fly at a specific speed over a certain distance, we're going to get there in a certain amount of time, okay, and it's using all of these three factors which will give us effectively answers for how long it's going to take to get somewhere, or if we know time and distance, how quickly we're flying, that kind of thing. Okay, but it's the main principle of how we navigate VFR. And not only does it form the basis of our navigation plog, but it's also going to form the basis of our VFR diversion as well. So if we look at the bottom, there's a couple of lines of terminology which is just worth being aware of. So firstly, heading is the actual heading steered by the aircraft, usually a magnetic, but it's effectively the point where the aircraft's pointing. Then we've got track. Track is a desired path of an aircraft over the surface of the Earth. So if we look at the small picture on the right, we can see there's a pink line between A and B that is also known as a track. Okay, so it's a line on the ground, an imaginary line. Ground speed is the actual speed of the airplane over the ground, so it takes into account the wind and how that will affect the speed of the aircraft. And then lastly, track made good. Okay, now we've looked at track, which is that line between A and B, and that's effectively our desired track. If we were planning a diversion between A and B, that's the most direct route. But there's lots of different factors such as wind that may push us off our desired track. And what that would create is something known as track made good. So track made good is effectively what the aircraft's actually doing over the ground. So now we're going to look at the steps of the diversion. Okay, so step 1, identify the diversion airfield or location, okay, that we're going to go to, and we're going to circle it on our chart. Now if we look at the top right corner of the chart, you can see our planned route, and there's a planned route coming in from the north. It goes via Oaklands, which is a disused airfield, and in this instance our planned destination was Oxford. Okay, and let's say for instance we get overhead Enstone and we hear from Oxford that they've had to close the tower, for instance. So we would obviously plan a new destination, because Oxford's no longer available, and what we're going to do is find a different alternative and then circle it on the chart. Okay, so identifying a point that we can divert to, that's our first step. Next step is to draw the route on the chart, and that's going to be from a specific point. So in this case, we're going to use Oaklands as a waypoint to our planned destination. And what I advise is using a different color permanent marker. So if you usually use black for your route, then use red because it stands out the most, and that way you can see clearly which track is your diversion one. So once we've done that, we've got a track from a waypoint to our destination, and we're going to run our finger along that route and just check for any NOTAMs, any airspace infringements, check for any hazards along the route which may cause us to amend that in any way. Okay, now it's important that we do draw the route on a chart, or if you've got something like Sky Demon, we could do it on something like that, because not only is it going to increase our situational awareness, but what a lot of experienced pilots don't realize is if you use something like the Garmin pictured on the left hand side or GPS function, what's going to happen is it's going to draw a direct route from where you are to where you want to go. Okay, and it won't take into account any airspace, any NOTAMs. So you might plan to divert somewhere, but it's going to take you straight through airspace. Okay, so these modern navigation devices won't take into account the things like airspace. So that's why it's important that we draw it on a chart or electronic charter. We have one such as ForFlight or Sky Demon to make sure we don't have an airspace or NOTAM infringement. So once we've drawn our route on the chart, in this instance from Oaklands to Briars Norton Airfield, we can use our plotter, protractor, or whatever we use to measure the distance, making sure we're using the correct scale for the chart, and then also figure out a track from A to B. Okay, and we can get these two figures, and it's important to either write them down on the chart or on a piece of paper to form a sort of mini plog, which we can reference off when we do a bit more planning later on. So far, what we've done is we've created a route from A to B, we've drawn it on the chart, and we've got our desired track. Okay, now if there was no wind, if we flew the desired track, that would be suitable, but effectively there is always wind, or 99% of the time there's always some kind of wind which will affect our route. So we need to take this into an account, and if we don't, what will happen is we'll encounter something called drift, which is where we're pushed off our desired track, which would basically give us a track made good. So what we need to do, just like a normal navigation flight, is we need to adjust our heading such that we can remain on our desired track even if we have a component of wind that we are subjected to. Okay, and working out how much we need to adjust our heading is what we effectively what we need to do, but it becomes more tricky now that we're airborne and we haven't got flight computers that we would usually use on the ground. And how much we adjust our heading, depending on the wind, is a number of factors, but it's mainly how strong the wind is and then where it's coming from. Okay, so if it's perpendicular to us in this scenario, then that's going to give us the greatest amount of possible drift, so that means we're going to have to adjust our heading the most. So obviously we've got a desired track here, and we need to adjust our heading to remain on that. If we don't adjust our heading enough, then we're going to be blown off our desired track, which is then going to create effectively a track made good, but it's not what we've desired, and then later on we're going to have to adjust for that to regain the track that we desired to reach our new destination. So because we're in the aircraft, it makes it a little bit difficult, and so we use a method called the max drift. Okay, obviously on the ground we use our flight computer, which makes things more accurate, but we don't have that luxury in the air. Okay, it's not practical for us to be putting information into a flight computer. It's a lot more time consuming, and it's going to take our concentration away from actually flying the plane. So we need to use mental calculations to estimate how much we adjust our heading so we can remain on our desired track. So the way we're going to account for this drift is the max drift technique. And what it does is max drift is the maximum value of drift that we could experience based on the strength of the wind. And depending on which heading we fly for the diversion, we'll take into account how much of this maximum drift we use. So the max drift equation is the wind speed, so how strong the wind is, which we would get when we're on the ground, depending on what altitude we're flying at, divided by our true airspeed that we're going to fly at. Okay, and again, that should be worked out in a prog beforehand, and then we're going to times that by 60, and that's going to give us, and you see the example below, so the values that it gives us in the example, if we're traveling at 90 knots and the wind speed was 15 knots, the maximum drift value is 10 degrees. So that means that the maximum value of drift that we could be experienced is 10 degrees. So now that we've got this value, we need to work out how we can apply it to our track heading in order to account for the wind so that we can remain on our desired track and then not be blown off track. Okay, so now we're going to look at how we apply it and what proportion we use of that maximum drift. So as seen on the previous slide before, the maximum drift for this example is 10 degrees. And maximum drift is the most when it's coming perpendicular to the aircraft, so 90 degrees. So in this case, we would apply the full amount of max drift. Okay. If you look in the right-hand picture, if it was coming at 45 degrees, we get an element of headwind, but also crosswind as well. So again, we are influenced by the wind, but not so much. So that means we would use lesser value of the maximum drift that we could possibly be exposed to. So we need to find a way to work out what proportion of the maximum drift we use depending on where it's coming from and where we're going to. So one way of doing this is known as the clock code, okay, and it can be used to estimate the amount of maximum drift to be applied. So how much of that 10 degrees value are we going to use to add that onto or subtract it from a heading, either way to give a more accurate heading for the actual conditions that are occurring. So here's an example. If the max drift is 10 degrees that we've just seen, the wind is 065 at 15, so we'd have already worked that out. We know where the wind is coming from our meteorological report on the ground. And for our heading, we're going to have to fly a heading of 030. And so we want to work out what drift, how much of that maximum drift should be applied. Okay. So the wind is 35 degrees off the aircraft's heading because we're flying 030, the wind's coming from 065. So that's a 35 degree difference. And we can use the clock code, which goes in a clockwise direction, and depending on the difference between where the nose is and where the wind's coming from, will tell us how much of that maximum drift we're going to use. Okay, so between 0 and 15 degrees, we don't use any max drift. Between 15 and 30, we use a quarter of the max drift, so it will be either 2 or 3 degrees. Between 30 and 45, we use half the max drift, so 5 degrees. Between 45 and 60, we're going to use 3/4, or if that angle is greater than 60 degrees, we're going to use the full value of maximum drift. Okay, so we can take this figure and then we're going to apply it in the direction where the wind's coming from. Okay, so if we go back to our example, the wind is 35 degrees off the aircraft heading, and so we can see using the clock code, we need to use half of the maximum drift, which is the equivalent to 5 degrees. We've already know that the heading is 030, so that's our diversion track that we need to use, and the wind is coming from a direction of 065. Okay, we know we need to use 5 degrees correction, so we're going to add that in the direction of where the wind is coming from, so we add it on, which means that our new heading is going to be 035, which is going to give us a correction. and it's also going to allow us to take into account the wind component. So it's important that we use what we have in the aircraft, and trying to imagine these angles in the aircraft can be quite tricky. So using different things in the aircraft will help it make it easier. So most training aircraft will be fitted with a CDI, and we can use this to estimate also how much of that wind we use. So here's an example. It's not the same as the example before, and we need to fly a heading of 030. We could put that at the top of the CDI, and say there's a wind that's coming from 350, so it's coming from the right hand side, and you can see that depicted with a red arrow. What we can do is we can imagine a vertical line going down, and from that we can get an estimation of how much of that maximum drift we're going to use. Now if you look at the diagram on the bottom right, it sort of breaks up the different sections, and again that's going to give us an indication of how much max drift we can use. And the further round that wind moves to becoming perpendicular, the further along the CDI deviation bar that orange line is going to move, which means we're going to apply more of that max drift. So it's just another tool to estimate how much max drift we can use, which might be a little bit easier to visually represent in the aircraft. Okay, this technique can also be used for estimating crosswind as well. So again, if you're coming into land, you could set it for the runway heading, and then depending on what the wind's doing, it's going to give you an estimation of how strong the crosswind is. So now we can start to put the planning of the diversion together. So we've got a wind corrected heading, so we've taken into account the wind to give us a more accurate heading to fly the diversion. Okay, now we need to see how long that diversion is going to take so we can get an ETA. Now, certainly for PPL or a flight test, you'd be expected to give an ETA to your diversion point. So we need to work out roughly how long that's going to take. Using some simple math technique will help us do this. So, for instance, if we're traveling at 90 knots, which is a sort of typical cruise speed, generally we're doing 1.5 miles every minute, okay, or it takes 40 seconds to do 1 mile. So based on this, we can work out how long it's going to take to do certain distances. So 3 miles will take 2 minutes, 6 miles will take 4 minutes, 9 miles will take 6 minutes. Okay, so again, that's going to give us an indication. Obviously, our ground speed may differ from where the wind is coming from and the strength, so we need to take that into account. But for instance, our example, which was 8 miles in distance, well, it's a little bit less than 9 miles, so it's going to take probably 5.5 minutes. And the crosswind was perpendicular, so the ground speed shouldn't be too much difference. Okay, obviously if there was a headwind, it might take slightly longer. If there was a tailwind, we might get there slightly quicker. So we need to take these factors into account to get an accurate timing for our destination. So once we're established on our diversion, we want to maintain it the best we can. And for the purpose of a PPL or a LAPL check ride, an examiner is looking for something called a stabilised heading. They want to see as least deviations as possible, trying to fly accurately as possible. But if, again, there are corrections needed, then that's understandable because sometimes wind calculations aren't exact. Okay, obviously we're going to use the dead reckoning technique as we've just gone through there. And then we can use the technique of fixing along a route to see if we're on our desired track or if we've drifted left or right. And fixing is finding a position on the ground and then finding it on a chart, and then we can see how we are in relation to that. Okay, so looking for major features such as rivers, airfields, towns, and seeing where that is along our route. Okay, are we on our desired track, or have we drifted left or right? Okay. It can also give us an indication of time as well. So if we were meant to pass over a certain town at the halfway point, and we're slightly ahead or behind that, again, we can use that for an indication of how we're doing on time and do we need to revise our ETA to reach a destination. Okay. So here's an example of fixing. It's the act of finding a geographical place on the ground and then finding that position on the chart. Okay, so you've got two examples here. One is Moreton in the Marsh, which is a disused airfield. So you'd see the disused airfield along your route, and then you could find that point on the chart. Again, you could, on the bottom one, you got the town of Leicester, and again, you could find that on the chart as well. Okay, so it enables you to update your timings, but also allows you to make sure that you're on your desired track. You haven't drifted left or right, which will stop you from getting lost. Okay, so we want to do this regularly on our route to maintain that situational awareness. So let's say, for instance, we've planned a diversion, we're flying it, but maybe our wing calculation wasn't accurate enough, or maybe we weren't flying the heading accurate enough, and we found out that we're off track. So we're either left or right of track. What we want to do is try and regain that. So there's no point just estimating, thinking you're a little bit left, a little bit right. We need to show that there's a proper method of regaining our track to reach our new planned diversion destination. Now, there's two ways of doing that. The first one is the 1 in 60 rule, which we'll go through, which is a bit more calculation, but it's potentially more accurate. And then we've got the standard closing angle, which is less accurate, but it's a lot easier to do. And what you'll find in practice is the standing closing angle is widely more used in actual flying because it's so much easier and then takes less mental capacity to work out. So first we're going to look at the 1 in 60 rule, and it's an equation that states for every, it looks at a 60 nautical mile leg, and for every nautical mile we are off track at the end of that 60 nautical miles equates to 1 degree in a track error angle. And we can use this equation to work out the distance or the angle between where we our desired track and effectively what our track where we are effectively on that route. So here's an example of using the 1 in 60. So we got from an A to B, okay, the pink dots and the line in between. Okay, that's our desired track, and our aircraft's the black, obviously airplane symbol. And we've seen that we're off track by some amount. We need to work out how we can regain our track to fly back to our desired destination. So first thing we need to do is work out what our track error angle is, and that's that top right angle between our desired track and where the aircraft actually has flown to. Okay, and to work that out we need to find our distance off track, so how many nautical miles either left or right we are of the desired track, and then divide that by the distance along track, so how far we've travelled from our original destination based on our desired track, and times that by 60, which is going to give us a figure in degrees. Okay, so that's our track error angle. We then need to find what our closing angle is, okay, which will be that bottom left hand circle, and it's the angle between the point that we're going to start our getting back on track, effectively the red line, and the pink line. It's the angle between there, and we've worked that out by distance off track, so how far we are from our destination based on our pink line. So it gives the example of 80 nautical miles, and then we divide that by the distance remaining, which is, sorry, the distance remaining being the 80 nautical miles. The distance off track will be the 5 miles left of the desired track, and then we're going to times that figure by 60, which is going to give us another figure in degrees. So at which point we found our track error angle and our closing angle. Okay, so two figures which we have figured out. Then what we need to do is work out how this applies to regaining our track. Okay, so what we do is use the equation by adding the track error angle, which is that first one, 15 degrees, and using the closing angle, which is that second angle of 4 degrees. We'll round it up, and we add that to our heading that we were meant to be on, and then that's going to give us the heading to reach our destination. Okay, so in this instance, the 15 plus the 4 equals 19. We're going to turn 19 to the right towards our track, which will take us back towards our diversion destination. Okay, so that's one way of doing it, the 1 in 60 rule. And as you can see, the 1 in 60 rule is quite tricky to do. It's a lot of calculations in the head. It makes it quite tricky. It can be done, but generally it's much harder than this next method, which we're going to look at, known as the standard closing angle. So the standing closing angle works on a constant depending on a speed. So depending on how fast we're flying will change the standard closing angle. So for a 90 knots aircraft, the figure is 40 degrees. As we go faster and faster, that angle reduces. So for 100 knots, that angle is 36 degrees. We just need to remember that figure for the standard closing angle. And what we need to do is, if we find ourselves off track, so again, if we look at the example on the right, this example says that we're 5 nautical miles off track, so we need to estimate how far off we are. And what we're going to do is turn in the direction towards our desired track by our standard closing angle, and we're going to maintain that new heading for however many miles we are. So if it's 5 nautical miles, we'll maintain that for 5 minutes. If it's 3 nautical miles off track, we'll maintain that for 3 minutes. Okay, at which point we'll go back to our original heading, and then we'll make an adjustment slightly because obviously it wasn't accurate enough. Okay, so by remembering the standard closing angle, which will be a constant for the aircraft you're flying, we just need to work out how far we are off track and then maintain that for however many minutes. So it's a direct correlation, and as you can see, that's a lot easier to work out in the air. It's a proven and tested method which works, so it's fine to use in a test, and it's, you see, compared to the 1 in 60, it's a lot easier to use. So it's all well and being good prepared for a diversion, and especially for PPL you will be, but what happens in practice is private pilots don't expect to divert, and then suddenly it becomes a lot trickier. They haven't got their tools with them, they haven't got their protractor, so they can't plan a diversion as well. Okay, and the big thing is having a protractor with you, measuring a heading, measuring a distance as well. But there's things that we can do to alleviate that and still estimate distances and headings without a protractor. Okay, so looking at a chart, we know that the VOR circle, so circled within the big green circle is a VOR. Okay, and it has an outer ring which is 5 nautical miles in diameter. Okay, that's from the center of it where the dot is to that outer ring. Okay, so you should know that 5 nautical miles. Well, if we know that distance, we can create a mini scale for ourselves. And if you look at the bit of paper, I've got something I had in the aircraft, a small aerodrome chart, an approach chart, and I've measured it up against this ring. I've put a line where the dot is in the middle. I've put a line where the outer ring is, and that distance is 5 nautical miles. Okay, and I could put that along my diversion route, work out how many 5 nautical miles there are, and get an estimation of how long my route is. Okay, so that's one thing that we could do. We can also use the VOR rows to estimate a heading. Okay, so again, we could draw our line on the chart and then use a piece of paper to parallel off the line to the VOR. Okay, so we could use the compass rose and get a sort of indication of the track, and we can actually be quite accurate. So if you see in the bottom left hand picture, you can see the compass markings, and by paralleling off a route or a diversion to the compass rose, would be able to get a track, and then all we've got to do is take some accounting for the wind. Okay, again, there's lots of things we can use to calculate wind. We could either ask an air traffic control unit what the wind is. I'm sure they'll have that information. We can use wind that we obtained where we took off from. So just having an understanding of where the wind's coming from, maybe looking at a cooling tower of a power station, see where the wind is blowing, which way it's blowing the clouds, that kind of thing. So as long as we can make some kind of estimation, again, if in the unlikely event that we actually have to divert for real, we've still got tools in the aircraft which can help us do so. So some common errors which can happen with diversion. So failure to note the time. Well, if we don't note the time, we don't know effectively when we're going to get there. Especially for longer diversions, this is more important. Being unaware of the fuel state before a diversion. So again, if you've got to do a long diversion, you might not actually have the fuel to get there. So being aware of how much fuel we've got is important. Improper calculations. So maybe you've done the wrong calculation. So that's why it's making it as simple as possible, using the simpler methods such as the standard closing angle, and the easier we make it, the less likely you are to make an improper calculation, which could ultimately have a detrimental effect. Okay, forgetting to turn towards the estimated heading. So what usually happens is people will start turning in a certain direction, but then actually what will happen is they won't fly that heading accurately. They'll just head in a direction, and then over time that gets progressively worse. Okay, and then lastly, getting lost. So making sure we do those regular fixes, making sure that we can identify points, going from big to small, from the ground to the chart, to make sure that we carry on having that situational awareness. So what can we conclude from this presentation on diversion? Well, firstly, the decision to divert can never be made too soon. If we think things aren't going to plan, like the weather, maybe someone's ill, it's always best to make the decision now rather than to wait to see what happens later on. Okay, usually people that tend to wait later on, they get themselves in a much worse situation than they need to. Okay, so if there's ever any doubt and you feel like diversion is needed, it's best to make the decision now than to wait later on, rather than the inconvenience. Okay, we don't need to do a full diversion. There may be times where we just need to adjust our heading by 10 or 20 degrees. Okay, so if there's a weather system in front of us, but there's a clear area left or right, we can plan a diversion which goes 5 nautical miles either west or east of our current track. Again, we can plan that, so we haven't got to fully rework a full diversion and then having that inconvenience of landing at a different aerodrome. And then lastly, don't just select the closest point to divert. Okay, think about all the options. So what facilities are there? Am I familiar with it? Especially in an emergency, the more familiar you are with an aerodrome, it's going to mean that you've got that extra capacity to work with the scenario you've got. Okay, so consider all options. Don't just choose the closest one to us. This concludes this presentation on diversions. I hope it was useful, and please feel free to contact us about any questions you may have. In addition, if you feel some more help is required, we offer one-to-one tuition which can be purchased on our website.